This is Johnnie Walker, whisky magnate extraordinaire, founder of the biggest Scotch whisky brand in the world. Sort of. He cuts a bit of a dash, striding purposefully forward with his top hat and his cane.
He looks like the sort of character you'd like to hang out with, much like his produce, but he's not a character at all. In fact, he was a real person. As far as I know, he didn't stride around with a top hat and a cane. He was way too busy running a grocer's shop.
Welcome to Scotland Unplugged, and the story of the real Johnnie Walker. This is the Johnnie Walker experience in Edinburgh.
It used to be a slightly out-of-date department store, which to be honest I kind of liked, but over a couple of years and over lockdown it morphed into a new swanky tribute to a brand. You can go in there and do various things, a lot of which seem to involve dry ice, fancy visuals, live action and tasting things. Unfortunately, I can't do any of that today because I've got to drive places.
This is all very nice, but Edinburgh isn't where Johnnie Walker came from.
So, where did it all begin? And how did Johnnie's whisky brand become the biggest Scotch on the planet?
This is Kilmarnock. And in this building, and what was the high street, John Walker had his grocer's store. Here's a statue of the man himself.
He's got a traffic cone on his head. Of course he does.
Maybe we should just agree that traffic cones on statues are Glasgow's thing. John Walker was born in 1805, the son of a farmer, Alexander Walker, who died when John was only 14. But he left behind £417 in trust, about £33,000 or $42,000 in today's money.
Not too shabby for a kick-off.
His trustees invested the money in a warehouse, grocery and wine and spirit shop.
Talk about covering all the bases. John made a success of it. He got married, had a son, Alexander, became a Freemason, etc. Then, in 1852, there was a bit of a disaster. A flood in Kilmarnock destroyed all John's stock, which would have shown up just how vulnerable his business really was.
In 1856, Alexander joined the business and persuaded John that they really needed to move into wholesaling. John died a year later.
Alexander had been apprenticed to a tea merchant in Glasgow for 4 years, and that meant he'd been trained in the art of blending tea, a skill set that would turn out to be pretty transferable.
John had started out supplying a range of different spirits, malts from distinct areas of the country.
But this was the 19th century, and distilling and malt whiskies weren't quite what they are now. In fact, they were pretty inconsistent.
John started out by blending whiskies to order, and by 1850 he was selling it under his own brand, Walker's Kilmarnock Whisky. In order to get the whisky he wanted, Alexander put his blending skills into practice. In 1865, he created his Old Highland Whisky.
Obviously it wasn't that old, and Kilmarnock very definitely isn't in the Highlands, but that kinda gives you a glimpse of the marketing mind we're dealing with here.
He blended malts from the different regions and added grain whisky to get the consistent flavour he wanted. Old Highland Whisky would later become Black Label. By this point, the railway had come to Kilmarnock. Glasgow was just along the line, and Alexander took full advantage. He got ships' captains to act as his agent, and that allowed him to export his whisky to the wider world. To avoid breakages, and to make sure he could cram as many bottles as possible into each box, he made the bottles square. And so the bottles stood out on the shelves and on the gantries of bars. He made the lettering as big as possible by attaching a diagonal label at a very precise 24 degrees. The building behind me is the Old Bond in Kilmarnock, where pretty much every process in the blending, storing and bottling of whisky took place.
They're pretty massive, as you can see, but these days they're council offices, which is a bit less exciting.
Alexander died here at his house, Crosby Tower, on the Troon seafront in 1889.
It obviously didn't have the swanky side extension it's got on it now, Although this was Alexander's last home, it would later become a hotel, and obviously now apartments, which tells you it's pretty huge. His sons, Alexander and George, introduced the white, red and black label whiskies.
Then in 1909, the striding man arrived.
The famous illustrator Tom Brown sketched the logo on a menu card over lunch. These days they'd probably need a focus group for that kind of thing.
Over the years he's transitioned a bit, depending on the sensibilities of the times.
In the beginning, whisky made up 8% of John Walker's business. By the time Alexander died, it's reckoned to have been between 90 and 95%. As of 2021, 223.7 million bottles are sold annually. Not bad for a side hustle that started out in a grocer's shop. But while there was a real John Walker, I get the feeling that the real Johnnie Walker was Alexander.